All right, so today I want to talk to you guys about what I think are essentially the 5 mini PCs to keep an eye out for in the holiday season of 2023. Now, these are some of the systems here, but we're going to go through them one by one. And first off, we're going to start off by talking about the lowest end of the product stack here. So that's these ultra cheap units right here, the GMKtec G3 and the GMKtec G1. Now these essentially just represent any systems that come with the Intel N95 and the Intel N100 processors. There's also the Intel N97 that I've been seeing show up in some systems. For the most part, these systems are practically identical, at least in terms of CPU performance. There's very little variation amongst all of them. They all relatively perform the same. Key differences, of course, being that the N95 has a stock TDP of 15 watts, and it only has a 16 EU version of the UHD graphics, so that is 16 graphics cores, but they go up to 1.2 gigahertz. The N100 has the same 4-core configuration, in fact, even the same base clock. The difference being that this has a 24 EU version of the iGPU, but it only goes up to 750 megahertz. So kind of some key differences between the two systems here. For the most part, any systems rocking these specific chips, you're going to find anywhere between the $130 all the way up to $230. At $130, these are very competitive. What we're looking at in terms of CPU performance is essentially Skylake levels of IPC, so around a Skylake i5, but they are extremely energy efficient. Some of the other downsides of these systems, though, is essentially limited RAM capacity. You can, on paper at least, only go up to 16 gigabytes of RAM, and part of it is because these systems are single channel. Intel did a lot to change up their what used to be known as Pentium and Celeron lines, now just generically named to Intel processors, but the Intel processors in here were gimped in a few ways so that they wouldn't become too competitive with the higher end of the product stack. One of the things that they did was essentially make all of these just single channel memory, so no more dual channel. You only get one RAM slot, and that pretty much caps out at 16 gigabytes if you go by the official spec. Very, very disappointing to see here indeed. But that doesn't take away from the fact that we still do have some fantastic CPU performance. At around $130 to $140, these are very competitive. Once you start to get into the $200 range, that's really where you have a lot more options, and these become a lot less attractive. That being said, for day-to-day computers, these are really tough to beat. 4 cores is more than adequate enough for most day-to-day tasks, which include web browsing and even using office applications and things like that, doing email, writing your schoolwork. I mean, people have been doing these things on computers now for decades. You know, if it was work that somebody was able to do with a Pentium 4, I promise you the CPU in here is going to handle it perfectly fine. And guess what? People were browsing the internet back then. Now, the internet has become more demanding, but in terms of the increase in performance from back then to this now, just in terms of CPU, it's not the same as what it was like using the internet back then and it is now. Opening up Wikipedia now might be more intensive than it was back then, but it's not exactly a meteoric workload for any of these systems to do. I think a lot of the times people overthink how much they really need in terms of performance, and this is going to be enough for the vast majority of people out there. One thing I will mention about the NUCbox G3 is just how easy it is to upgrade. Pretty much just pop off the top and you have full access to everything there. The G1 you need to unscrew down here, and that has been my experience with most systems with the N95 and the N100. So if you want an easily upgradable system, I really recommend this G3. But for Black Friday, I would definitely keep an eye out for these systems hitting around a $120 mark. Some of them might even go down to $100 at that price point. These are really, really good to pick up. You're going to be able to run a lot of different software on here. If you want a system that has more power than a Raspberry Pi, but you want to do a lot of those Raspberry Pi self-hosted projects, you're going to be able to do all of those perfectly fine on here with an overall better experience, since x86 is just so widely supported in comparison to ARM. So definitely keep an eye out on some of these systems today. Now moving on to the next performance tier, this is around the $200 to $300 price mark, though mostly targeting around the $200 to $250. Really, there's just a lot of fluctuation in prices here, and things get a little bit more interesting. Now here you can see some of the systems that are around this price point. Here we have the TRIGKEY Speed S5 running the Ryzen 5 5500U, but they currently have systems that are also available with the 5560U, as well as the 5800H and the 5700U. Now this is the ACEMAGICIAN AM06 Pro. This is rocking a Ryzen 5 5600U, but you can find systems with this specific chip also rocking pretty much the same configurations as the TRIGKEY, except I think this one goes up to the 5800U, not the H version. And of course we have the Sur 5, which has been around in a bunch of different incarnations. We've had a version with the 5500U, version with the 5600H, a version with the 5700U, a version with the 5560U, a version with the 5800H, and then a updated revised version with the 5800H. So the Sur 5 has really had a long life. It really just depends on what time of the year you're looking at it, depending on just what the configuration is going to be. But right now, what is currently available and what will more than likely be available during the holiday season is the version with the 5560U. You will still find some with the 5500U, but they seem to be dying out in stock. But there is also the version with the 5700U. Now, all three of these systems here have their own merits and stuff like that. These two right here, I practically consider them to be identical to each other. For the most part, they're built exactly the same. There are just some differences in terms of how cooling is done. Most of the ventilation here is on the side, while this one has ventilation on the side and at the top. In general, the Sur 5 will run cooler, but one thing that I do like about the TRIGKEY specifically is that it is stackable. You'll pretty much be able to get multiple of these and stack them up, and it won't interfere with the cooling. Obviously, the middle systems are going to get hotter just because of the radiating heat off of the other ones, but because they're so low power, it won't really cause any issues at all. And if you want to do essentially a stacked cluster of these, you can do that far easier than the Sur 5. Where since it has the top ventilation here, you don't really want to stack anything on top of it while it's actually running. In general, the performance is pretty much the same between these two when it is equal chips, though again, the Sur 5 does end up being a little bit quieter because of the overall better ventilation on it. So if silence is all you really care about, the version with the 5560U is a really, really great option. What separates the 5500U from the 5560U is actually the fact that the 5560U is running on Zen 3 instead of Zen 2, so it is a architecture ahead, though it didn't come with all of the cache increases that came with all of the other Zen 3 chips. So there is an IPC uplift, though it isn't substantial. It still overall does lead to a better CPU experience, which means that the overall experience of actually using the system is better. The biggest downside of the 5560U is that you do lose one GPU core, and you do lose some maximum clock speed on the GPU, which overall does end up leading to around a 10% reduction in overall gaming performance, though in certain titles it actually ends up being more like a 15% reduction. So if gaming is what matters the most to you, I would consider either the TRIGKEY or the Sur 5 with one of the higher end Ryzen 5s, or you just go for the Ryzen 7 version, which I would really just recommend you do. I think that the Sur 5 with the 5700U is pretty much right now of the budget tier the best option. You get the 8 cores, you get the 8-core GPU, you get a higher clock speed, and you're pretty much not paying that much more. We're looking at around a $20 to $40 difference just depending on the day. And during Black Friday, I really expect those systems with the 5700U to actually hit some crazy prices. If we can see a sub $200 5560U version, then I can see it being a compelling option. But as of right now, I would really recommend looking at the Ryzen 7 versions of either of these systems instead of the Ryzen 5. Unless we could get some incredible deals on these two, I really think that Ryzen 7 is the way to go at that price point. Now, I talked a lot about those other two systems, but this one is also here. I did not like this system as much as the other two. I will say that much. One of the biggest downsides is that the CPU is limited to just 15 watts. You can raise it up to 25 watts, but this chassis was not designed for that. So it will start to overheat at 25 watts. That means that it overall does have worse performance than the other systems, but this is more efficient. Since it's running at 15 watts, it uses up less power. And its biggest selling point is the Dualland NYX. Now, if they were 2.5 gigabit, I would pretty much say that this is a super recommendation. Because there are just 1 gig NYX, I'm not going to fight as hard for this system, but that does mean that this is a really great way to get 6 cores, 12 threads for a virtualization server. If you want to essentially start hosting your own router instead, this right here makes that so much easier. You could pretty much just virtualize any kind of self-hosted router software, and you'll still have more than enough horsepower to do practically anything else that you would want with this system. That is the biggest advantage here. Again, if it was dual 2.5 gig NYX, I would recommend this a lot more. This is really, really niche. That being said, though, again, with the other two systems that we looked at, I said go with the Ryzen 7 version. I recommend the same thing for this. I think that at the 15 watt TDP, it should be perfectly fine. Yes, you're not going to get the full performance of the chip that you have in there because they're kind of just meant to run with more wattage to get the maximum performance. But in the use case where you're going to be doing a lot of virtualization or just running a lot of Docker containers and stuff like that, you don't need everything to be running all at once. You just want to have all of those cores so that things could be spread out and you just have all of that headroom for those moments where you really, really need that extra CPU. And because it's so efficient, well, this is not going to exactly pull a lot of wattage from the wall, so you're not spending a lot of money to have this operating. But this one is very, very niche. Now, the last system that I want to take a look at is the one that I have loved the most using in the past few weeks. That is, of course, the Sur 5 Max, the upgraded version of this system. Key differences between the two of them really is coming down to the TDP more than anything else. Though the overall construction and design is slightly different, the Sur 5 Max is built to be very similar to the Sur 6. It's pretty much the exact same body design, just repurposed here, though with some slight tweaks. The Sur 5 Max comes with the Ryzen 7 5800H, and it has a stock TDP of 54 watts. That is a really high TDP. As a comparison, the Sur 5, in all of its incarnations that I've used, has gone as low as 15 watts all the way up to 35. Now, these are stock TDPs. It really just depends on the exact model, but none of them have gone past 35. Even the Sur 6 with the Ryzen 5 6600H, that one capped out at 45 watts. This goes all the way to 54. Now, what that means is that all 8 cores of the CPU and all 8 cores of the GPU could be running at their maximum clock speeds without ever really needing to fight with each other over power. That means you could actually fully utilize your hardware here. That's pretty major for a mini PC. And the biggest surprise is that even though there's really no footprint increase over the Sur 5, the Sur 5 Max is actually able to keep the hardware in here pretty cool throughout the usage. Now, the system is louder than the other ones, though. If you want a dead silent system, dead silent system, I'm telling you, the 5560U with those extra efficiency gains from Zen 3 really is a extremely quiet system. Even at full load, I could not get it to be as loud as the TRIGKEY at full load. And both of them are already very quiet systems in comparison to this. This can get noticeably loud if you're using it, though not annoyingly so. It's definitely noticeable, but it's not the worst sound in the world. And I think that if you keep this behind your monitor or anything like that, most of the noise is just going to be mitigated anyway. But it is something to keep in mind. Again, if you care about noise, go with the 5560U version. It is just so quiet and so efficient. It's actually insane. But if you want maximum performance, this is about as good as it gets up until around the 400 to, I would say more closer to the around $450 to $500 mark. Because the CPU in here, the 5800H, does perform actually very, very similar to the Ryzen 7 6800H, which is one generation newer, and then the 7735HS, which is technically 2 generations newer, but it's really just a refreshed version of the 6800H. but that is being sold today on brand new systems that are around the $500 mark. Some of them going into the lower 400s, but it really just depends on the configuration that you're going with. I would say that if you're going with a system with the 6800H or the 7735HS, I would really just get 32 gigabytes of RAM and maybe at least a terabyte of storage. I have seen some versions of the Sur 6 Max that only come with 16 gigabytes of RAM and 500 gigabytes of SSD storage, and that just seems way too low for me. If you're going to upgrade it yourself for cheaper, I can understand, but sometimes it'll be like an extra $20 just to get double the RAM and double the storage. So definitely keep an eye out for that, but I think that the Sur 5 Max is going to see some nice discounts during the holiday season. We've already seen it go as low as $288. At that price point, this is a steal. If we could find these on sale during the holiday season for around $250, $275, this is an insane deal, because you would essentially need to be paying twice as much to get a bump in the iGPU while seeing very minimal increase in terms of CPU. The CPU is really the saving grace of this system. It's what makes it such a good deal, especially if you're looking to make a high availability cluster. If you could pick up, let's say 3 of these at $275 a pop, getting 8 cores, 16 threads, 16 or maybe even 32 gigabytes of RAM on each system at those prices, that's insane levels of performance and insane levels of density. That's density that a lot of people will spend $50 on a Xeon to get. But now the individual core performance is going to be disastrous in comparison to this, where each individual core is going to be extremely fast, and then all of them working together is going to be extremely fast. Now, you might have noticed of me talking about all of these different systems is that I only recommended Intel at the very, very low end of the budget. I did not talk about them in the middle section or high end, which, to be fair, I'm not going to talk about any high end right now. This is about as good of a deal as it's really going to get for most people, besides the Sur 6 Max, which we might see some crazy deals on, but in terms of price to performance, this is king right now. And Intel just has nothing in their higher tiers that competes with this. They don't even really have much of anything that competes directly with this. Yeah, it can get competitive in terms of performance, at least on the CPU side, or they have plenty of CPUs that will beat this thing out, but not at the same TDP, and not in terms of GPU performance, and definitely not in price. I bought the cheapest Intel system that actually had a 12th gen that was $250 bare bones. So to actually get it configured to compete, it was a lot closer to this guy's price, but it got beaten out by this. At its stock TDP, which this Intel system, stock TDP, 45 watts with an i5 12450H, a 8-core 12-thread CPU versus a 6-core 12-thread that at this point was multiple generations old. This still beat it out while consuming less power from the wall. The Intel system needed its TDP bumped up from 45 watts all the way up to 60, which its power supply that it included could barely handle. And I would not run that 24/7. That was pretty much for testing purposes. You will damage your power supply if you just run it like that. So for testing purposes, I went all the way up to 60 watts and it finally beat this thing out. But at that point, we were using pretty much almost 3 times the wattage. Now from the wall, it was actually using about half as much as the Intel system. But that really just shows you how far behind Intel is in terms of mini PCs. They have pretty much given up. They've lost the battle. Even Intel themselves have left the market. They have discontinued their NUC line and are leaving it to the OEMs to essentially try to peddle hardware that right now does not really meet much of a purpose in the current market. Now, I'm not going to sit there and tell you that Intel has absolutely no merit in existing. There are certain advantages of it. Specifically, the reason why I love these systems is because of the fact that they are very cheap, but they come with the Intel iGPU that has the built-in Intel encoder-decoder engine, and that is extremely powerful, and it makes these systems into actually competent home servers. But you can get that on the low end for Intel. You don't necessarily need a mid-tier for them to benefit from a lot of that. And besides how good and well supported their media encoder engine is, their graphics performance even on their highest end systems can't compete with this, let alone RDNA 2 or RDNA 3, with many of those systems again losing to the Sur 5 non-max version. So if the iGPU on this is enough to clear pretty much anything that Intel has, it makes it a tough sell in general to buy Intel because you need to use more power for the CPUs, which is the only place where they're really competitive on, and their iGPU, besides its built-in encoder being so well supported, does not really compete with any of these. And these also do have built-in encoders, they're just not as well supported. And that is changing over time. More things support it, like OBS now uses it, so if you want to use these for a streaming system, you definitely can. But if you want a headache-free experience, almost always you're better off going with Intel, or at least when it comes to the support of their hardware acceleration. But outside of that, the Beelink Sur 5 Max is pretty much the system to keep an eye out for this holiday season. If we could see some insane deals on this, I can't think of any other mini PC that's worth buying more than this right now, unless you really need that extra gaming performance that comes with the higher tier, that being the Sur 6 Max and all of the other systems that rock the exact same chip. But if you need a CPU uplift, well, at that point you're looking at going into systems so expensive that maybe just consider a desktop. It really, this is pretty much as good as it gets for a mini PC in terms of not getting to a price point where building your own computer becomes a lot more of a viable option. So that's why this is the price to performance king right now. So I hope you found this useful. If you did, be sure to subscribe, and I will catch you guys in the next one.